Hello everyone. Hello from SCOA. My name is Humaira Mehboob, and I welcome you all to today's very important webinar. And this webinar is important because of the timing. The 26th January is coming up, and we would, as the peak body for settlement, talk about it a little bit more because it affects all of us. This webinar will be formally started by our CEO, Maria Demopoulos AM. And after that, we have a moderated panel conversation. And then we have, at the end of the webinar, we have like 10 minutes for your Q&As, for questions. Kindly please put your questions in the chat. And I hand over to Maria.
Thanks so much, Humaira, and good afternoon, everybody who are joining us today. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which we're all joining virtually today. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge, of course, the ongoing sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I also recognise that many people in our sector are joining this conversation while carrying their own histories of displacement, survival, and histories really that are quite complex. So I thank you for taking the time to be here. As Humaira said, my name's Maria Demopoulos and I'm proudly the CEO of the Settlement Council of Australia. Today's webinar is a critical one from our point of view. It's being done in partnership with the National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice, and it sits quite intentionally in the week leading up to January 26, because we know there's a lot of conversation that's going on out there. This conversation is designed to be reflective, not prescriptive. We know that January 26 carries many different meanings for many different people. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, though, it marks invasion, dispossession, and survival. For many others, it's been framed as a moment of national unity and welcome. And for many, of course, in the settlement sector itself, this conversation is one that perhaps you're encountering for the very first time, often while navigating other concerns, community sensitivities, and very real fears about getting it right, about understanding it respectfully. We get that. So today is not an attempt to blame. It's certainly not an attempt to land at an absolutely correct position. What it is about trusting that our sector can have these conversations respectfully and in a way that actually contributes to social cohesion. Because we know that settlement isn't just about services, and we certainly provide excellent standard of services across this nation. We know that it's actually about having harder conversations about what is belonging. What does it truly mean to belong? What does it mean to have shared responsibility around particular key issues? So we're joined today by 4 panellists who bring deep expertise and lived leadership to this important conversation. Professor Andrew Gunston, who's going to help ground us in the importance of truth-telling in Australia's history and what's lost when unity is pursued without truth. Shankar Kesanathan will speak to multicultural leadership, solidarity, and what happens to social cohesion when difficult histories are avoided rather than engaged. Luna Foley, a Roads to Reconciliation advocate and so much more. Of course, he works with the Bulldogs, my second best team, Luna. But he's going to reflect on confidence, on language, and what enables people to engage in truth-telling in communities without fear, without shame, but in a way that genuinely is about building the strength of our communities. And Judy Tang, finally, but certainly not least, a Roads to Reconciliation advocate as well. She's going to bring to the conversation a lens around what does sustained engagement look like at that systems level, not just performative, not just symbolic gestures, but embedded into our system. So genuine responsibility. Now, the format, as Humaira pointed out, is quite simple. We're going to move through our moderated conversation and then open it up to you for some audience questions. So we really do want to encourage you to use the chat function. So without further ado, let me start. Andrew, hello. If I could get you to introduce yourself first and a very, very brief overview of the National Centre, of course, but then to launch into this conversation. Now, many people have been talking about truth-telling, knowing our history, but through your work, what does that really mean? And more particularly, what does it mean when we do it through the lens of the settlement ecosystem? Andrew, over to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Maria. Thanks so much for the invitation to present in this seminar. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging traditional owners of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across the country, acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and in my case, acknowledge the Wurundjeri people in Naarm, where I have the privilege of working and living and playing. So again, thanks so much for the invitation. The National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice, which is the has a number of projects. We're the leading national academic think tank on reconciliation. We have a number of big projects we're doing, and one of the key ones is the Roads to Reconciliation project, which Maria and Shanka have run for the last couple of years, and Judy, Luna and many others have been, we've been really privileged to have them on board our journey. And that's been a really wonderful project, engaging multicultural communities in reconciliation in Indigenous Australia. So we've been having some really great conversations in that respect. And so I think it's a really good initiative SCOA is doing with this event. It's a really contested date, more so than in many other countries. And I think it's a really good idea to educate communities and to find out, as you say, Maria, it's not an antagonistic debate, but really having a thoughtful reflection on what the date means. And so, yes, one of the questions you did ask me to look at is, why is truth-telling about Australia's history essential? And what is lost if it's softened or avoided? And my argument about truth-telling is it's critical for all of us in Australia, all of our citizens, newly arrived Indigenous peoples, people who came on the first fleet, all of us citizens in Australia. Truth-telling is really critical to understand where we've been in the past, where we are at the moment, and how best to create a shared future. We're not really going to have a better shared future and looking at issues of harmony and social cohesion if we don't understand where we've come from. Truth is also a really critical plank in the reconciliation movement. The National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice has liberally included truth as one of our key three areas. So you can't have reconciliation without justice, and you can't have justice without truth. So we've made a deliberate decision to include truth as a critical area. And an example of where things can go wrong if truth-telling isn't understood, many people remember the referendum we had just 2 years ago, where all states and territories, except for the ACT, rejected the referendum. The referendum is to have a simple proposition that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should have a voice to the federal government, not a veto power, but just an advisory body. Now, this was comprehensively defeated. The analysis of myself and other academics around the country clearly shows that one of the key reasons this was defeated was of ignorance about truth-telling in this country. So many of us who campaigned in the referendum were really quite shocked at the lack of understanding people had about Indigenous peoples and the history in this country. So truth-telling is really critical if we're going to have any engaged, sensible discussions about our citizenship and our sovereignty as a country and where we move forward. So I think truth-telling is really critical. I'll talk about this a bit later, but my argument also, it's not just truth-telling, but we as non-Indigenous people need to go beyond truth-telling to truth-listening and to truth enacting, but I'll talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, because it'd be good to hear a little bit more later on, Andrew, about what does that look like in practice? Because we talk about it a lot, but the sector often says, yes, but how do I enact that? What does it look like as an organisation or a community-led organisation in particular? How can I make that look real and not just performative? But can I just ask you, Andrew, before we do move on, it's also important that we do accept that the current framing around this day is, hey, it's a day of national sort of unification, really. It's a day that we get together and celebrate. How does a frame like that, though, one that deliberately avoids history and is only looking at the future, what's so wrong with that is another question that I get asked. Isn't that a good thing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Look, I could be wrong, but as far as I'm aware, Australia is the only country in the world that actually celebrates this National Day on the anniversary of the country being invaded. So the formal invasion happened on 26th of January, and that's the anniversary of the invasion. I don't know any other country that commemorates its national day on that day. And the problem with that, of course, is it completely marginalises 120,000 plus year history of First Peoples in this country which, as we all know, is the longest continuing culture on the planet. So other countries commemorate their days on anniversaries of a treaty or the Declaration of Independence, of winning a war, or a group of separate groups coming together to be a federation, or the date the Constitution was signed. But no one I know of other country commemorates on that date. So my sort of simple view is, how can we genuinely progress our national reconciliation journey when our National Day commemorates an invasion rather than a nation-building moment? It deliberately excludes Indigenous peoples. And just to really make this clear, we've only had this date as a formal national holiday in Australia for just a couple of decades. There's actually been a far greater history of protesting on this day and acknowledging that this was a day of mourning or an invasion for much, much longer than any official date of commemoration.
Yeah, that often comes as a surprise to many people, because people imagine this is a date that's been immovable since time immemorial, but it was actually a very recent thing.
Absolutely. I think it was 1994. And before that, it was commemorating different dates across the country. There was always seemed to be commemorated in New South Wales, because it was really a New South Wales date. But of course, it's historically inaccurate to say that's when the entire country happened anyhow, because of course, the invasion happened at different points in Australia's geographical area. This is really just when the invasion occurred in Sydney. So it's quite inaccurate to say that. I think a lot of studies show that people don't really understand what the day commemorates anyhow. There's been some interesting studies recently that show that people think this day commemorates when Australia signed a treaty, which Australia never has, or when it became a republic, which we clearly know it's never become a republic. Most people don't know what the reason it is for, whereas most people in the United States would know why they've got the 4th of July. So I think we might like the idea of a barbecue and a national celebration, but I don't think people really intuitively are wedded to this date because they don't know what the date actually signifies. So I think there's a real possibility to look at. Of course, people want to have a day to commemorate, but it does not have to be on this day, which is so divisive for many people.
Andrew, thank you. Shankar, that point I think that we're trying to make is that many multicultural communities, newly arrived communities, they understand what it means to have their history erased or silenced. How can that shared experience actually, instead of being divisive, provide an important bridge to have solidarity with First Peoples?
Thanks, Mara. And I thank Professor Gunston for effectively summing up today's webinar in that 4-minute finish there at the end about that. As something that I strongly believe and share, that multicultural communities, by and large, are not wedded to January 26th. And those people and those communities are, well, I can assure you that the next generation will not. The institutions and systems that have set up for there to be some significance around January 26th, maybe a citizenship ceremony is taking place on that day that's important to you and your family. All of that will, I can assure you, fade with time and should. I want to share a really quick memory that I have of it being a 5-year-old visiting Parliament House for the first time in Canberra and going on a tour and listening to an older kid sort of share some frustration, saying, I think to a mother, with all this symbolism and tokens in this Parliament House dedicated to Aboriginal people, what else do they want? And I remember turning to my older sister Sudha, and she was about 9 or 10 at the time, and she really quickly turned to me and said, these people need more than symbolisms and tokenisms when everything has been taken away from them. That's a 9-10-year-old who's just come to this country, who has fresh memories of hiding in the attic of a house in Colombo when a genocide is taking place around her, and has the awareness to be able to say, as a 10-year-old new to this country, that something awful has happened here in this place, that we have become the indirect beneficiaries of by coming here and landing here. Migrants and refugees know that we did not begin colonisation, but we also need to know that we live within its consequences, and that we participate in systems that are shaped by this history. And as you said, Marie, many migrant refugee communities understand displacement, we understand loss, we understand survival. And for First Nations people, this date, this ridiculous date, marks invasion, marks resistance and the ongoing work of staying alive as sovereign peoples. And when we avoid this truth, we do cause harm, not only to First Nations communities, but to the integrity of our shared communal life. I think when we talk about multicultural leadership, What we're asking is to face history honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. Reconciliation in the work that we've been doing at the National Centre is not achieved through a date on a calendar or dates, but it's built through ongoing relationships. It's built through deep listening. It's built through accountability and a willingness to learn. If there's one thing I want to share with those listening, it's that this is, as you said at the outset, not about blame. It's about truth. It's about respect. And it's about how we want to exercise our shared commitment to this notion of belonging that we should put on a pedestal, because that's what we should be striving for, is this notion of how do we belong in this place where a 10-year-old arriving in this country knows that something awful has happened here and it has not reconciled.
But a question I often get, Shankar, is why is it so sensitive and why is it such a hard conversation to have, particularly within our multicultural communities where there is an essential shared understanding of displacement, of the kind of silencing that we talked? Why is it such a sensitive conversation? Are we doing it wrong? Are we framing it in ways that make people feel threatened by it? This is the question that I do get put a lot.
We have grown up, and I say we, those of us who came as kids in this country, and adults in this country, have grown up within this really sort of almost quarantined, clean pathway that's Harmony Days, and days that we can come together and celebrate our diversity without recognising that their foundation of social cohesion, real social cohesion, is being able to have difficult conversations, being able to speak to and engage with truth, and be able to recognise that there's some work to be done here. Lila Watson, Aboriginal Queensland woman, who said, if you've come here to support me or help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your stuff in your liberation, pursuit of liberation, is tied up in my pursuit of liberation, then let's work together. I have another story of my uncle who arrived in this country looking for a job, also escaping Sri Lanka, where he managed hotels and corporations, and wasn't able to get a job as an accountant in this country. But he was able to get a job working in East Arnhem Land with the Yirrkala people, who saw him, recognised him, supported this Tamil young man who was so far away from his family, was displaced off his country. And he was able to work alongside that community, working as their accountant, managing their corporation. And his two communities coexisting, working together. And he felt seen, he felt understood by that community. And I guess I'm speaking to that story because it's a notion of relationship, and relationships not formed on these false platitudes that come with Harmony Day celebrations, but the courage and the integrity of difficult conversation and difficult truths and difficult systems that are built around us that would prefer to have neat patterns and systems that can be controlled and contained, and not these challenging conversations which will take time, which will take investment, which will take resources in order for us to build an authentic understanding of what it means to be a truly multicultural community where we can live and where we can connect, embedded within the truth-telling and the search for justice that Australia has been Australia's history and will surely be Australia's future.
Powerful words, Shankar. Luna, I want to turn to you if I could. You're a community leader. You do a lot in this area of work. Can I perhaps start by asking you, firstly, what motivated you to actually put your hand up for this program, Roads to Reconciliation, which we know is quite a pioneering one that was funded by the Victorian government and then, of course, supported through the National Centre. But why? What was your motivation for doing something like this?
Yeah. I think with me, coming from West Africa in an already minority country in the continent of Africa itself, when I came to Ballarat, it was a host of mixed, I guess, things in terms of like how people viewed you. Some people were super curious. People asked if your hair was real. yeah, basically everything you can imagine, I kind of received super early on. And for me, you know, where we come from, we're quite active, we're out and about, out a lot, and thank God, the Ballarat Youth Services were able to actually put us into programs when we first came, as young kids. And what that did for me was it just opened my eyes, it exposed me to other, you know, cultural groups, minority groups, and obviously the Aboriginal culture was there as well. In particular, a few people at school who were similar. You know, I didn't know anyone was almost as dark as me prior to coming here. But to find out that they are and they're not Africans, but they're, you know, Aboriginals, and Torres Strait Islanders, it was quite surreal to me early days in Ballarat. And I guess from that and also the different youth programs, I was keen just to learn more. Like I said, I definitely saw a lot of similarities between our culture and their culture. We're still quite traditional in terms of, you know, we use herbal medicine and things like that. Back home, you can still hunt pretty freely. You know, you can make a slingshot, go in the bush and hunt birds and things like that. And here, unless you're indigenous, you can't. So for me, you know, I saw a lot of similarities and I wanted to kind of learn more. And also you only grow and know how to support other people better by knowing more about their journey, you know, what they're about, things they like and don't like, and their stories as well. And through that, I was quite keen just to keep learning more. When the Roads to Reconciliation came on board, I saw it as an opportunity to basically take that to the next level, you know, through some of the projects we did, but also going to, you know, Indigenous land and connecting with culture and learning about, you know, the different history and traditions that they had as well. For me, it was just, you know, it was a personal development opportunity that um, yeah, that I thought could get me quite far. On the other hand, my partner's Aboriginal as well, so it was another way for me, I guess, to understand her culture, even though different mobs are quite different. You know, her mob in Sydney, the Beautify, you know, compared to what we saw in Portland, are very different in terms of how they operate, you know, some of their tradition and beliefs as well. So for me, that's learnings I can take, you know, into my adulthood as well. And then now my partner and I have a young one who just turned 1 year old, who is now, you know, African Aboriginal Australian, or Aboriginal African Australian. And for me, you know, supporting her in her growth now, I yeah, I think I will do a great job knowing, you know, that I do have a great connection to her culture, which is her mom's side of culture, but my own traditional culture as well. And then coming to Australia young and growing up here myself, I feel I'm pretty well equipped to making sure, you know, when she grows up, she's still connected to both those cultures, while not losing her own Australian culture where she was born as well. So yeah, so for me, it's an, you know, never-ending journey of learning that I think would equip me to support my community the best I can, which, you know, I would say have supported me a lot in my role now at the Bulldogs, where I do a mix of football, list and recruiting for all multicultural people, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as well. And then on the flip side, my community work with the Community Foundation at the club, running youth programs and multicultural events, and creating a pathway for those young Indigenous people in the community that do want to become footballers. One part of my gig that, you know, we probably don't talk about, and I don't think we are as much, but I'll talk about it here, is when we find talented young Indigenous kids and we want to basically give them a chance to be in the draft, we've actually got to prove they're Indigenous. And I've realized how challenging that process is, you know, going to different mobs and learning your ancestry tree. And then if there's missing links in those tree, it makes it more difficult. And yeah, and having
The real point,
all
though, isn't it, Luna, that thing about sometimes people say, oh, that's all in the past. We need to move on. I think that example you're giving is, no, this is very much the present. This is what First Peoples still have to deal with in terms of that systemic and ongoing impact of colonisation. Such an important point.
100%, 100%.
Mm,
But
mm,
yeah, I think all the stuff I have done,
yeah,
including the, work
yeah,
through the National Center of
yeah,
Reconciliation, have actually helped me be able to go, know
yeah.
what mob to reach out to, or know how to, support them in finding their ancestral tree as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a
Luna,
lot.
can I ask you, because you did do a lot, I mean, one of the roles that the community advocates had was to essentially go out to the range of communities and engage with them about what were often really hard conversations to have. And I know that you did quite a fantastic job at doing that. Is there an example, though, you can share where, rather than protecting communities from discomfort, because I often think that's quite patronising to communities, where you did go in and you did have an honest conversation, and as a result, communities were sort of entrusted really to be able to go on and then build that knowledge with others. Is there an example that you can share?
Not one directly top of my head. I
Yeah,
think through the natural conversations we had,
yeah.
and I try to purposely reach out to a lot of young people. I think
Oh,
for
yes.
me, and the young people that I connected with, it was an opportunity for them again to learn a bit, but also just to start, I'm going to take a step back about those sensitive conversations. I think a lot of multicultural young people don't actually think it's a sensitive conversation. They more so think they don't want to be in an area where they might be basically cancelled by other people. Cancel culture for young people is a big thing. And I think a lot of people tend not to, potentially not rock up to things like this because they might think other people would think differently of them, or speak out for, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islands communities, again, also because other people might think differently of them. I think a lot of multicultural people in Victoria are all for having a different day to celebrate. It's very much not in our hands, as we all know. The politicians hold the power, which then goes back into, working with these communities as much as we can to give them that voice with the politicians in government. And I think that's where, going back to what Shenka said before, I also see long term that I don't think we're going to have too much of an issue with this long term, because a lot of amazing people are doing great work now, and a lot of younger people are really much getting on the board and the idea of that the day doesn't need to change, and that it's a very selected few people in all of Australia really that are keen for that day.
Luna, thank you. And I think that, yes, there's a groundswell of real, genuine wanting to understand this and to get to a place where we're not having the same conversations every year. We're actually progressing together towards some sort of genuine reconciliation moment. Dr. Judy Tang, you were involved in Roads to Reconciliation, but you're also someone who is the, commissioner, obviously, at the Victorian Multicultural Commission. You do a lot of work at that systems level. From your perspective, if we were going to engage communities around this conversation in a meaningful way, any insights that you can offer, particularly in your experiences across various projects and programs that you're involved in?
I think thanks for that, Maria. It's first and foremost is to really acknowledge how important it was to have something like Roads to Reconciliation made in the first place. That was why I jumped at the opportunity, because there was really nothing that built that bridge between multicultural communities and First Nations. So, and well, I'm, very much in my 40s now, and I sort of, I feel like I was born, having been born in Australia, it's taken 40 years for this kind of initiative and project to come up. It in that sense has led to, I feel like there's a lot of catching up that we need to do, and I'm really glad it started off with Roads to Reconciliation. I think I wanted to notice that. So at the first instance, we talk about setting up structures. I think it's important to acknowledge that there was no structures and no opportunities for any meaningful engagement in the first place. So we're really much in step one with it all. Having said that, it's also quite important to remember to meet the person, meet the community where they are. So I remember when I was doing some stuff with Roads to Reconciliation and talking with multicultural communities and families, there is an appetite to listen and to learn and to understand, but there wasn't the opportunity. So if they're busy trying to work a full-time job, take their kids to school, get the bills paid, at what point will they be able to sit in on a webinar or do some kind of online short course or whatever it is? So meeting them where they are is absolutely important. And for a lot of the younger generation, that's at schools, right? So we need to, I'm thinking back to my own childhood, very, very limited and shallow education around Aboriginal history and all that. And then again, it wasn't until I was an adult that I was able to participate in some cultural training. But that's because I had the time and the opportunity to do that, to learn. So meaningful engagement means meeting them where they are, and understanding, asking questions like, are they in survival mode at the moment? And does that mean now is not the best time? Or how can we, even they are in survival mode, provide that space and the opportunity for things like, which I'm sure Professor Gunston will talk about, truth telling and truth listening.
Absolutely. Judy, can I ask you, though, in terms of, again, thinking about the critical role that you play almost in that brokerage, if you like, is there any learnings, though, about what we mustn't do? I mean, this is the other part of it. Are there approaches that really have fallen seriously short of meaningfully engaging? Because I also see people kind of coming along and almost kind of knocking people on the head with this stuff. Is there any learnings that you can share? And Shankar's kind of doing what I know now of you quite well. When he touches his earlobe, it means he's got something to say about this. Yeah. But so I am going to invite all of you to contribute
feel
to
free
this.
to jump in.
Because I'll be frank, folks, here I am in 2026 as someone who, has been involved in these conversations for a fair bit of time, and I'm still sometimes taken aback about the same resistance or similar arguments. And then people will say, yes, but you've got to actually take a different approach. And I'm still searching for what that different approach might look like. So are we not framing it right? Is it on us, those of us who are trying to get the message out? Judy, any thoughts? And then Shankar, you're bursting at the edges here. Judy.
I feel like there needs to be a lot more top-down work.
Right.
Having things like citizenship days on this particular day is not helping. And the, how would you say? I mean, the people receiving their citizenship didn't choose January 26th. It could have been any other day. So why do they pick that? And that just creates even more of a distance to facilitating that kind of social cohesion and that belongingness between communities. So that's already one. The other one is, I'm going to always tie it to funding, because unfortunately we do live in a world where money does talk. And if let's see if I can give an analogy. For a lot of multicultural organizations and communities, there's a lot of advocacy and prompting that we need to allocate funding, for example, to translate resources and work sort of around communication. Same thing, if we want to really build bridges and ensure that there's an ongoing commitment to working with First Nations and truth telling and truth listening, then there has to be a funding allocated to that, making sure that particular NAIDOC week, for example, there's funding allocated to that multicultural communities, multicultural organizations, or particular organizations do something around that facilitates keeps things in front of mind, and then from there move things along.
Yeah. Shankar, I'm going to invite you to make a comment, but Celia, I think the comment you've put in the chat box is such a critical one. In essence, I think that recognition that yes, there is those shared histories at times, but there are communities, newly arrived communities, that feel such a powerful attachment to the 26th because that's the day they were naturalised, folks. So for them, it is a symbol of freedom. It is a symbol of freedom from persecution, the beginning of living a safer life in Australia. That question is such a critical one. How can we support conversations that acknowledge both of these perspectives? Is that a fair starting point, Shankar? And then Andrew and Luna, thoughts?
Absolutely, Celia, definitely. It's a very fair point. When we think about racism in this country, there's the explicit racism that you and I might find in the schoolyards or on the street. And then there is the layers and layers of racism and institutional racism that you and I and our families and communities will experience every day. And part of that institutional racism is this notion that when you find refuge and safety in this country, that we will hand you a citizenship on this particular day, and therefore we will inadvertently tie you to this day as though it is an important day for you hereafter. Or all the other examples that I can think of where we have this pathway that is built in our organisations, let's call it Harmony Week, where this is the day where we get to celebrate you and your contribution to this organisation, and we will ignore you for the rest of the time. And so a challenge that I put to us, and a challenge that we've been testing as part of our work, links back to, I shared the story of when I was living and working in the East Kimberley, a place called Kununurra on Mirrawong Gadgeron country. I found that community came together when an MP was visiting or there was an opportunity for engagement with government, and circled around and made sure that they had to grab the seat, and then community got stuck into them and did truth telling, raised all the questions that mob was having, and it was a masterclass in advocacy. What I've been seeing in my time as whether as a policy advisor to the Minister for Multicultural Affairs in Canberra or as Commissioner here in Victoria is I see like all this hospitality offered by multicultural communities to MPs when they come for festival and events. You see the massive line to get a selfie with the Premier at the Deepavali Festival. And not one of those moments do you see mob or our mob asking, hey, so by the way, while I'm grabbing a photo with you, what have you done to invest in this or that, etc. And there is a massive shortage and a gap in our communities around how to advocate is what I'm essentially getting at. We have a serious challenge with even confronting power in our communities. And what we've tried to do with Roads to Reconciliation is create a focus on this notion of how do our communities actually galvanise, empower themselves and advocate to power on the issues and struggles that we've been experiencing since we arrived here. And so one of the ways we do that in concert, speaking to the notion of Lila Watson's call to action, which is don't come here to support me, but let's work together, is we've been drawing on case studies and insights from Aboriginal resistance and protests and movements. Mabo, the call for the 1967 referendum outcome. We've been looking at these case studies and we've been workshopping them in workshops with multicultural community leaders right across the state of Victoria to essentially look at that question of how do we collectively challenge the institutions on the different issues and challenges that we are experiencing in our communities, whether it's racism in the health system, racism in education, racism in the employment workplace, and drawing from that knowledge and insights of First Nations people and what they have done and how they have done and how they have survived. Also to shift this notion that we had that Aboriginal people are this poor suffering community that we need to support. But no, they're actually this resilient, surviving community that we can draw lessons and insights from and work together with and draw from, so that we're not stuck with Australia Day as the day that we get handed our citizenship, and therefore we have some fidelity to that day, but that we can collectively look at how we are pitched against each other, how history has been written for us, and how we have to have the agency to go and do the research, go and do the insights and find out that how we can look at social cohesion as not some day that we celebrate ourselves, but as how we collectively come and recognise all the stuff that we need to still do to live the kind of lives that we are entitled to in this country.
Sorry, Professor Gunston, Andrew, can I ask you then, how could we possibly do that in real ways? I mean, what does this work look like in practice for you?
Sure, thanks, Maria. I just wanted to say at the start, we've talked a lot about roads to reconciliation, but I just thought it'd be really important to recognise a dear friend of Maria's and mine, Professor Jackie Huggins, who's one of Australia's greatest reconciliation leaders, whose great idea was for Maria and Shankar and I to connect and drive this project. So I just wanted to recognise Professor Huggins there. I think it relates a bit to what I sort of alluded to in my first comments about the notion of truth-telling, truth listening and truth enacting. We've had three major truth-telling inquiries in this country's history. We had a Royal Commission in 35 years ago, so it's been interesting to hear all the discussion in the news in the last few weeks about having a Royal Commission. Without getting into the pros and cons of that, it's important to note they're not necessarily the panacea that often people think they are. There's a Royal Commission to Aboriginal deaths in custody 35 years ago. Since then, hundreds and hundreds of Aboriginal people continue to die in police and prison cells, and the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people overrepresented in prison has gone from under 10% to close to 30%, and this is from a population of 3% of the overall population, which shows the institutional racism in the police and the judiciary and the prison systems in this country. We've had the Bringing Them Home report, which is about the horrific stealing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait children for decades and decades in 1997. Again, of the 54 recommendations of that report, the vast majority have not been implemented. The vast majority of the 339 recommendations of the Royal Commission weren't implemented. And then, of course, we had Australia's first Indigenous-led Truth Commission last year, the Europe Justice Commission, and under the leadership of preeminent Indigenous Victorians and other Indigenous Australians. That's had a whole bunch of recommendations that has not yet been adopted by the Victorian government. So it's really important for non-Indigenous people not only engage in hearing truth-telling of Aboriginal people telling their stories, but to listen. And I don't think we've, in non-Indigenous Australia, really got to that stage of really genuinely hearing stories. So one thing I'd urge all the viewers here is to Google the Europe Justice Commission, to Google the Royal Commission, to Google Bringing Them Home, to have a look at some of these recommendations about self-determination, about sovereignty, about Indigenous rights, and to learn from some of those areas. But then moving beyond truth-telling and truth listening is that truth enacting, and how do we actually, as societies, engage in the truth? And one of the things that sort of struck me as a story that I think Maria and Shankar have told you this about a couple of years ago when I was campaigning for the referendum. I remember going to a small country town, Victoria, for 1 week for the Roads to Reconciliation project. A few weeks later, it was for a local reconciliation group that invited me to speak. And a few weeks later, it was for a major Indigenous event. And what shocked me was all three of these events were almost mutually exclusive from each other. It wasn't that engaging. And I think we need to build up those intersectionality approaches as well. So again, something I'm also co-chair of Reconciliation Victoria, something I've talked to Reconciliation Victoria and other reconciliation organisations around the country. We need to get much more multicultural engagement in reconciliation. Reconciliation used to be seen very much as a dialogue between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples of European or English ancestry. We need to ensure that multicultural communities are having a big say in this space as well. So really encourage anyone listening to go to the Reconciliation Victoria's website or any of the state reconciliation websites and connect into one of the local reconciliation groups. So I think that truth enacting is really important. Engaging, as Judy said, Dr. Tang said, about working with communities, engaging with local traditional owners, and also engaging with Indigenous knowledges. There's lots of Indigenous local media. So this goes back to that comment, Marie, you asked about earlier about what practical steps can you do. There's enormous, I mean, there's an old Australian anthropologist, W.H. Stan, who talked about the Great Australian Silence, and that was in an era where non-Indigenous engagement with Indigenous issues was virtually non-existent. But that's not the case anymore. There is Indigenous filmmakers, authors, media. A big shout out to a dear friend of the National Centre, Uncle Charles Parkin of Victorian Aboriginal News, who does an amazing job doing Aboriginal stories. Many other websites, and there's a lot of ways for any non-Indigenous peoples can engage in Indigenous Australian to learn more. And I really encourage that as a starting step, at least to start to understand why, for example, so many Indigenous people don't agree with January 26th being the national holiday, because it commemorates an invasion, and to start to see through Indigenous eyes. And going back to Paul Keating's seminal speech, the Redfern speech back in 1993, to walk in other people's shoes is a really critical first step.
And Andrew, I did want to say that some people might have questions about, well, where are the First Peoples in this webinar? And this is our learning as well. We did actually at the Settlement Council reach out to friends, colleagues in First Nations organisations. Obviously, for those of you that attended the settlement conference late last year will know that we signed an agreement, an MOU with Reconciliation Australia. The feedback that we got very loudly from First Peoples organisations and representatives was, look, the cultural load on us on this day is huge, and we actually feel like we just want to be able to spend that time appreciating and understanding the grief that exists in our community, not only about the date itself, but of course the referendum and all that came with that. So I do want to acknowledge that that was a key learning for us, is we also need to appreciate where that responsibility rests with non-Indigenous people about really taking up some of these issues. So I think it's an important point. Look, I do want to encourage people to put any questions that they might have. And I recognise that people might be a bit nervous about asking questions. I think it is important that we create these safe opportunities where we can have respectful, open dialogue around this. Luna, you're feeling hopeful. You've said that to us during the webinar. I know that in conversations you and I have had, you've often talked about, and that smile when you talk about your daughter says it all. But what's the hope about for you? I mean, you're hearing young people talk more and more about this, but why so hopeful?
Yeah, I'm so hopeful. One, to all of you guys who are a little bit older than me, and have done a lot of amazing work, in the community space, not just for, non-Indigenous people, but Indigenous people themselves. And I guess that's the first step. It might be a bit personal, but I'm definitely feeling like there is good platforms being set up, by my peers and my elders, for the younger people to now, really grab onto and take it to the next level. And I think, young people in particular are at an age where we feel it's easy to get things done. I think it used to be a lot harder to get anything done, but I think now, especially with social media and just AI and everything, you can pretty much create something, again, a pretty quick and big following in a short period of time. And then with that following, you can use to, challenge different people, government or not. So for me, that's one. And two, I think as the global world shows at the moment, relationships between different cultures and groups are quite fragile. And I think, that's the benefit to a multicultural Victoria and Australia, is the fact that we have so many nations, and because of that, you're going to have friends from different nations. So it's going to make it harder and harder and harder for you to criticize, different people, because I guarantee you're going to know someone or have a friend or a friend who is either from that cultural background, or their parents or their, aunties, cousins, etc. So I think for me, all that together is what I see creating a more positive future forward. A lot of different people do a lot of work. And then again, what I said about cancel culture before, I think young people, when it comes to it, know the right ways to push different buttons in government. And I think, we're definitely seeing a little bit of that, not just with young people, but everyone else across the board. People are starting to tune in on this idea that, that day for particular isn't great as a start, but also do acknowledging that not enough has been done for the Indigenous community as a whole, in Australia. And then knowing that, legally, sovereignty was never ceded, so there's actually scope there to actually do more as well, which is why I stand so hopeful. And then obviously with my own daughter as well, she's not an anomaly. I know plenty of other families who have mixed with Aboriginal or Torres Islander in their family as well. And again, the more and more that happens, the less and less we'll feel the effects of it going forward, because it will become harder for you as an individual, even if you're not educated on the topic, if you have any sort of connection or relation with someone that identifies, it is going to make it incredibly hard for you to do something that might, hurt that group in the long term. And I think it's a matter of time, not if but when for me. And I'm hoping that, it is hopefully is part of my generation that come up that can, make that change.
Not if, but when. I'm going to ask a final question because I am aware of time fast running out, because we could be here talking for a lot more. But Judy, if the settlement sector, I'm going to put this briefly to each of you if I could, if the settlement sector could do one thing differently around January the 26th as it approaches, from your point of view, what would it be?
I think and I'm welcome everyone to also throw, and I'm sure Shankar, you should be going with the ear, with words to say. I think it's from starting from the get-go. So, having opportunities to share stories, to help understand the place that you've come to, and it assists with the settlement process when people know and understand true history, and how to move on from there or work with that knowledge is probably the most important thing for me.
Thanks, Judy. Luna, one line. What can we do differently out there in settlement sector?
I don't have one line. I think for me, just, continue engaging, continue learning, and for the different platforms that do work, towards true reconciliation. I think for me, it's aiming even above, above and beyond. I know with the National Centre, with you, Andrew, you're doing so much work across so many different areas. And I think sometimes looking from the outside, we don't always understand exactly what you're doing. So for me, especially for young people, they see one big end goal, and then everything working towards that would be, the parts they can be part of. So for me, and I do still strongly believe this, I think I said it during one of our meetings for the National Reconciliation Project. I think our end goal is supporting the Indigenous community being recognised nationally, whether that's, having their flag included in the Australian flag, like a joint flag or something. If young people and communities see that as like the end goal you're fighting for, it might become easier for, the whole systems, everything else you're doing project-wise and system advocacy as well, because people will know it's going to link to something nationally, a symbol of unity between all cultures and Indigenous culture if they're recognised nationally on the international stage.
Thanks, Luna. Andrew, a quick final word.
Sure. Just probably to reiterate, it's I think we need to, from all groups, try to come together more often, engage. So, if all the different groups engage that sort of intersectionality and have greater engagement and knowledge sharing, I think is a really important way to see what we can engage with as in a unified way.
Shankar, I'm going to give you the final word.
I think that we collectively need to quit this fixation that we have with success and false hope and notions of celebration, and we need to put it in the bin, and we need to reimagine and celebrate difficult, honest, challenging conversations which may not have solutions that will be in by 5 p.m. today, and that we have these incredibly challenging conversations where we together have this debate about what does Australia look like and what is needed for our sense of belonging in this place with this sordid history that we have all inherited by becoming citizens of this country or trying to become citizens of this country. So move away from this fixation of false hope and happiness and towards challenging, authentic honesty about our history and where we're going together with the real challenges that society has for this multicultural Australia.
That's a great note to end on. I'd like to think that as the peak body, the Settlement Council of Australia, and what it tries to do with the conversations that, or at least the space to have the conversations, is to say, look, we're not going to issue you with a set of instructions around this particular discussion. What we're going to do is really invite you into a space that does recognise complexity. In some ways, I think, as you said, Shankar, we need to celebrate that complexity, not a constant rush to comfort or, as you say, the final sort of this is what success might look like. And I think the other part of it is the trust factor. Trust in communities, trust that they don't need to be protected from the truth, trust that communities actually do have the kind of relational infrastructure that can carry these hard conversations forward. And I think we need to kind of spend a little bit more time revisiting that. And I think finally, if I could say that what I really appreciate about the panel today is that avoiding truth, avoiding truth-telling and an understanding of the past doesn't actually help us at all. If anything, I think it means that it takes us further and further away from what that reimagining could look like for a nation that truly is built on genuine unity and reconciliation. And solidarity grows, of course, when we do appreciate that when history is faced and not avoided. Look, can I take the opportunity to thank each and every one of you. Every time SCOA reaches out to good people like yourself, there's always such a generosity and a willingness to work with us around that. We extend that to all of you joining us today virtually. We will actually be putting all of this information on our YouTube channel. We'll be circulating it through our socials and, of course, issuing a statement on January 2026, on January 26th, 2026. Folks, thanks again. Always appreciate you. Go well.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.